Football is a nasty sport, isn't it? Very rough. Very rough. And, you know, of all the different equipment, when you go out there and play, if you're in the NFL or even in college, even in high school, the gear is very important, isn't it? And of all the gear that's out there, there's nothing that is more important for a football player to wear than the helmet. You've got to protect the head, don't you? You could survive a broken leg, a broken hand, but you can't mess with the head. And so you've got protective gear. It costs money. It's well made. It's there to protect your head. Well, we've got a lot that's going on in our world as well, and we've got headshots that are coming from all different angles. Go off to school. The Bible's filled with errors and contradictions. Boom! There's a headshot. We all got here through naturalistic evolutionary processes. Boom! There's another headshot. You watch television, National Geographic or Discovery Channel or History Channel, and you hear about the Gnostic Gospels, who put the Bible together? It was Constantine or someone like that, or a group of people who decided this is what we're going to have in our Bible, and these other books that don't agree with us, we're just going to banish and burn them. And so the reason we're believing what we believe today as Christians, according to some of these television programs, is because that's what we've been handed down over the years. It's not because it's true. And had the Gnostics won, we would have gotten that stuff instead of what we have. Boom! Boom! All these headshots without any protection whatsoever. And we're not talking about our bodies here. We're talking about our souls. Much more important. Headgear. What kind of headgear would we need when it comes to something like what we're talking about here, all these arguments against Christianity? We need something called apologetics. We need to be able to learn to defend our faith. And in fact, Peter says in 1 Peter 3:15, to sanctify or set apart Christ as Lord in our hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks us to give an account of the hope that is in us, yet with gentleness and respect. Apologetics is very important. It's the defense of the Christian faith. And I believe that there's nothing that is more effective in helping us share our faith or defend our faith than the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, what we're going to be studying this week. Things such as the creation-evolution debate are very important. There's no question about it. And it's a lot of fun to study. But when we're talking about the resurrection, let's say if you talk about creation-evolution, if you prove that there's an intelligent designer who created the universe and life in mind, we get God perhaps. But it's not necessarily the Christian God. It could be the Muslim God. It could be the Christian God, a number of other gods. But when we talk about the resurrection of Jesus, you get God and Christianity. So, we're going to run through some of this week. What I'm going to do, let me just tell you a little about myself and where I'm coming from. And maybe some more of the things I say this week will make sense. I'm 48 years old. And when I was going through school, I went to Liberty University for my undergraduate and graduate work. And during my graduate time, I was specializing in the study of New Testament Greek. And I was really enjoying it. I wanted to read the New Testament in its original language. And so I was just studying, spending endless hours doing that and just loving it. But then one day I asked myself the question, is this stuff true? How will I know if it's true? I mean, after all, I'd been raised in a Christian family, became a Christian at the age of 10. I never really questioned my faith and asked, how do I know if this stuff is true? I had told Muslims that what they believe is false. I had told Buddhists that what they believe is false. And to be honest with you, at that point, I didn't even have a clue in what they really believed. All I knew is what I believed was right. And I hadn't even engaged in any objections against the faith at that point, because I didn't know that there really were any. I thought it was just some people chose to serve God and some didn't. So once I started to look at this and thought, well, is the reason I'm a Christian because this is the way I've chosen. This is the way I was raised. What if I'd been raised in Afghanistan? Would I be a Muslim? If I'd been raised in China, would I be an atheist, etc.? How do I know that what I believe is honestly true? And so this introduced a lot of doubts within my own Christian life. And it was the apologetics, the evidence for God's existence, the evidence that we're created, the evidence for the resurrection that pulled me back into my faith. But a couple years later, I started to wonder if when I did my investigation, did I really do an open-minded investigation, or was I just trying to prove what I already believed? And so now I started to doubt my faith once again, and just about as much as I did before. Now, you see, I need to share with you that, of course, we all have idiosyncrasies, right? Well, one of mine is that I'm a second guesser. I can't even go into a department store and purchase a bottle of cologne without wondering whether I got the right thing before I even get out of the store. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Don't you hate that? Well, if you think that's difficult for a second guesser to choose and buy something simple as a bottle of cologne, try choosing a spouse. When I went to college, I wanted to come out with a good education and a good wife. And so as soon as I got to school, I started to ask married couples, realizing there was a divorce rate of about 50%. I started to ask married couples, now that you've been married for a while, tell me what's really important in marriage. You know, I'm sure that I've got some idealistic expectations or things that I think should be right to look for in a spouse. That now that you've been married for a while, you realize maybe they're just not, those things aren't so important after all, and there are other things that are more important. Tell me, let me learn from your mistakes. So I interviewed probably several dozen married couples, and then I took all their answers and I put them down, and then I cataloged them, and I came up with what I called the 5 C's of complete compatibility. I know, this relationship brought to you by the letter C. So by the time I got to graduate school, I got really weird at that point, because you see, after I'd ask a girl out on a date, and then I'd go back to my room that night, I'd start a file on her. And I would write down those 5 C's, and then I would assess how we were jiving in each of those 5 categories. And then I'd put, okay, well, maybe I have a little red flag here, but this looks pretty good, and here's some questions to ask during our next date, things like this. And so for me, it was just totally cerebral. I mean, yes, I could develop the emotion, of course, but I wanted to make sure that I subjected my emotions to logic, to reason, because I wanted to make a good choice here. And I realized with a divorce rate of about 50%, just naturally speaking, I had a 50-50 chance of making it. I wanted the odds better in my favor. And so I figured the better choice I make, the easier my marriage will be. Marriage is never going to be easy, but the easier it will be if I make a better choice. And so I went through all these things, and you know, if any time during a dating relationship, if I felt that we just weren't going to jive at all in any of those 5 areas, I stopped pursuing the friendship. Finally, I met Debbie, and 18 months later, we got married. But I doubted all the way up to the altar. And even though I had gone through all that analysis and said, yep, she'll be good to marry, this is a good woman here, even at the altar, because I'm the second guesser, I had these doubts, and it's like there's these 2 guys on my shoulder. And the guy on my right shoulder was saying, relax, you thought this thing through, you made a good choice. But the guy on my left shoulder wasn't so confident, and he was saying something in my ear, something like, run, Forrest, run! Well, glad I didn't, because I've been married 22 years this year, and April will be 23 years. So I'm glad I went through all that thinking. Now, if you think it's difficult for a second guesser to make a choice regarding a spouse, then try choosing a worldview. If I make a bad choice regarding a bottle of cologne, I've only wasted $40. Make a bad choice regarding a spouse, well, it's going to cost me perhaps the rest of my life. If I make a bad choice regarding my worldview, the consequences are potentially eternal. And so I was thinking, wow, here I am. I'm Christian. I want to make sure I get this thing right. Yes, I've even written on the subject of the resurrection, and I've debated the subject and all this, but I want to make sure I get this thing right. I've only got this one life. And so that's what led me into another period of skepticism and doubt. And so I worked really hard on my doctoral dissertation. I decided to do the resurrection of Jesus, and I decided to do it from a different perspective virtually everybody who had studied and written on the resurrection up until that point, and according to Gary Habermas, about 3,400 academic journals and books had been written on the resurrection of Jesus since 1975. That's a lot. Very popular topic, but almost all of those have been written by biblical scholars and a few philosophers. And I wondered, well, wait a minute, asking whether Jesus rose from the dead, that is a historical question. And biblical scholars, whether they're Christian or not Christian, they're certainly biased out there. Christians want it, like myself, want it to be true. Non-Christians don't want it to be true. They want to disprove it if you're an atheist. So what about a professional historian? How would they approach it? Would they approach it differently than a biblical scholar? And I found out that only about a handful of professional historians had actually ever written on the resurrection of Jesus from that kind of a perspective. But they were only a few journal articles, small journal articles, in one small book. Nothing comprehensive had ever been done from that perspective. I said, well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to find out how professional historians would approach a question like this, and then I'm going to do it this way and see what we can come up with. And maybe I can prove the resurrection from a different perspective. Well, it didn't take long for me studying this to what professional historians were saying to realize that they were saying we're all biased, and that if you're going to be an honest historian, you've got to bracket your desired outcome while your investigation proceeds. Well, that wasn't my intent. I thought, okay, well, if I'm going to do this right, I've got to do this right. And being the second guesser I am, I want to make sure I do this right from the very beginning this time, because I don't want to have another crisis of faith later on. And I have to tell you that the 5.5 years that I was involved in my research were the most agonizing of my life. There were times, because remember, I'm bracketing now, trying to bracket my biases and worldview and look at this as objectively as possible. That's really hard. I had never done that before, and it was really hard. I remember laying in bed one night, and it was quiet, the lights were off. I thought my wife was asleep, and I heard her voice break through the silence, and she said, "You're doubting again, aren't you?" "Yep." "So what do you believe?" "I don't know. I think God exists, that's about all of which I'm certain. I might need to be looking for a new job now, though, because here I was, a director of apologetics for the largest Protestant denomination in North America, and I no longer knew what I believed, no longer knew if Christianity was true. And I just, in integrity, didn't know if I could stay in that position if at the end of my research I came to the conclusion that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. But for me, finding and discovering truth was the most important thing in my life. And so in order to counter that kind of a bias, I thought, well, you know, a lot of these people who come out and they write against the historical Jesus, the traditional Jesus, that is, the Jesus in the New Testament, they're making a lot of money off these books. So even if I did give up my faith in Christianity, I could write one of these books, formerly one of the leaders in one of the leaders in the largest Protestant denomination in North America. I could make a boatload and I wouldn't need my job any longer. So I would do these things in order to counter my bias, to try to neutralize things. Anyway, you can see it was just an agonizing process for me to go through this. But after 5.5 years of researching this, and whereas the average doctoral dissertation is 60 to 80,000 words, mine was about 285,000 words. So I just had to cross every T and dot every I as much as possible. And then what I would do is I would engage in debates with some of the brightest minds in North America, skeptical minds. So I was able to debate Elaine Pagels, a distinguished professor of religion at Princeton, Bart Ehrman, a distinguished professor of New Testament and early Christianity at UNC Chapel Hill. And I wanted to debate them because, as skeptics, they had a dog in the fight too. I guess being from Atlanta, I shouldn't use that kind of figures. So they had reasons as well for not wanting the resurrection to be true. And so whereas can you still hear me? Okay. Whereas I knew that I had blind spots. They're blind spots. I wouldn't know what they were. So that's why I would have these bright minds. They could find the weaknesses in my argument, and then I could give consideration to what they said.
So before these debates, I would pray and I'd say, God, if what I believe is wrong, please show me. I have these blind spots. Show me where I'm wrong. I don't care if you humiliate me publicly. I just want to know that what I believe is wrong, if it's wrong. I want to follow the truth. So that's why I would engage in these sorts of debates. And I know that since they were doing it publicly, they would want to know this stuff really well. Can't hear anymore? Yeah, I heard this kind of went out like a minute or two ago. Okay. This is still on. We good? There we go. So, thanks. So that's where I'm coming from. And so what I'm going to be doing this week is showing you and sharing with you a lot of my research on this topic. You've got some textbooks. Those of you who are students here, you got some textbooks. You got that one that Gary Habermas and I co-authored a couple of years ago. I just found out about 3-4 weeks ago that my dissertation is going to be published, so that should be coming out in November. The working title is The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach. That may be the final title. It will be published by InterVarsity Press or IVP Academic. So anyway, that should be coming out around November, and you'll be able to get everything, all the part of the research. So let's go ahead and talk about how we can approach this as a historian. How would we do this? All right. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to lecture here for a while, and for the purposes of their recording this, I'd appreciate it if you just hold your questions until the end, and not of this whole week, but I'll lecture for maybe 50 minutes or something like that, and then we can I'll take some questions for a while, and that way they can shut the cameras off. All right. Now, you guys can all see this? It's 30 pounds, sorry, 33 minutes. You know what that is? A rail? Yep, you're right. It is a rail. In fact, that is from the B&O Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the very first railroad in our country. Now, my grandfather was a railroad engineer. My great-grandfather worked on the railroad. For some reason, it's just in my blood, too. I've always loved trains. Something very nostalgic about them. I've loved traveling on them at times, although it's been a long time since I've done that. Love passenger trains especially. Sometimes my daughter and I will just get in the car at night, we'll go out and we'll watch the Amtrak pass. We just had a lot of fun doing that. And so, did this just fade out again? Did it? Okay. So, and it will just, we just love trains. So anyway, I was up in Baltimore last March, and my mom and I went and visited the B&O Train Museum in downtown Baltimore. And so I asked the manager there, I said, can I purchase a segment of retired rail? And she said, I think we can arrange that. And so like a month later, I was able to get the segment of rail. And so this dates to the 1920s. It was laid down. So B&O trains ran over this thing. And it's just a pretty cool thing to have there as a paperweight. Now, let me ask you all a question. How do you know that this is what I'm saying it is? You've seen something like this before. You know it's a rail from a train. Either it was actually used that way or it was made to look that way at least, but it would serve that function. How do you know that this is the actual rail from the B&O Railroad? I told you. Okay, so you got an eyewitness. Well, kind of. Did I see it there? I didn't see the welder come and chop this thing up. I was in Atlanta at the time. So how do I know that this is? How do you know that this is? Okay. So, I mean, I'm an eyewitness, right? And hopefully I'm somewhat credible. But people do lie at times, right? People can exaggerate in order to make a good illustration. Pastors do that all the time, don't they? Unfortunately. So do politicians, of course, too. And suppose I believe that this is true, but maybe I was deceived. Well, glad you asked that. What I did ask for the manager of the museum is if she would type a letter for me certifying what this is. So she sent this to me. And here's a letter. It's on B&O, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum letterhead. And here's what it says, May 21st, 2009. This section of rail was manufactured between 1923 and 1927 for use by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. It is 100-pound rail, which translates to a weight of approximately 33 pounds for this 12-inch section. This section of rail came from behind the roundhouse by what is now Platform 2, where the train ride currently departs. This route is the location of the original first 1.5 miles of commercial track ever laid in this country. So I've got an official letter, don't I? Certificate certifying that this is Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, a rail permit. I've even got this that was sent with an official U.S. government stamp on there, right? So I've got a government seal, I've got an official document, and you have me, an eyewitness, who says this rail is from the B&O Railroad. Now let me ask you all a question. Can you be 100% certain, absolutely certain, that this is from the B&O Railroad? No. Eyewitness, official document, government stamp. And you still can't be 100%. You're right, you can't be. Because, number one, I could be lying. And even if I'm telling the truth, then I am. Even if I'm telling the truth, how do I know that the manager isn't pulling my leg? Maybe she just cut it from anywhere. Hey, Joe, go out and cut that from over there at the Norfolk and Southern Railroad. They won't miss it. You heard about that derailment up in Baltimore a few months ago, right? So how do we know that that's not the case? And even if she was told, she told Joe to go out and cut this piece of rail, go over by track 2, platform 2, and get this. Maybe Joe thought it was platform 2, and it was actually platform 3 that he went to and got it. And maybe he went to platform 3, maybe he didn't realize it was that. Maybe he even realized it was that, and then he was afraid to tell the manager that he cut it from platform 3, and so she really believes it. And again, maybe he went to the wrong one, didn't know it was the wrong one, maybe he believes it. So the thing is, we can't be absolutely or 100% certain about it. But we can be reasonably certain now, can't we? Do you think that we as individuals then are warranted in believing that this is from the B&O Railroad? Sure. We're warranted in believing that, although we cannot be absolutely certain. Here's the point I want to make to you. You've got this rail right in front of you. You can see it, right? It's right here. You got an eyewitness saying it's B&O, from the B&O Railroad. We got a letter, we got a government seal, and we still can't be absolutely certain with all of this. Now, if we have this quality of evidence and we can't be absolutely certain, then there's very, very, very little in history for which we can be absolutely certain. Because in history, we don't have this quality of evidence. What we have are documents from the past, written by biased authors who were selecting what they recorded, and they all had biases, whether they were for or against something, they all had biases. And there's just no way for us to, because of all these problems and many others that we'll be discussing, there's just no way that we can be absolutely certain on things when we're talking about historically speaking. But we can have reasonable certainty. We can have adequate certainty. And so when we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus, I want you to know that I want you to have a realistic expectation. We're not looking for absolute certainty. Historical investigation will never give us absolute historical certainty. We're looking for reasonable and adequate certainty. That's what historians do for everything. And that's what we're looking for when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus. All right. Now, with that said, Why is the resurrection important? Well, the resurrection is important because this is what Jesus said about it. When he was out there teaching, he made some really radical claims. He claimed to be God's agent, chosen to usher in his kingdom. He claimed to be God's uniquely divine Son. He claimed to have the authority to forgive sins, resulting in our salvation. Now, when you make those kind of claims, your critics are going to come back to you and ask you for some proof, some evidence. And Jesus' critics were no different. And they said, show us a sign. Give us a miracle, something, to prove that you are who you claim to be. And Jesus said, I'll give you one sign, my resurrection from the dead. John chapter 2, verses 18 through 22, Jesus overturns the tables in the temple, and they said, show us a sign that you have this kind of authority. And Jesus said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it. They thought, of course, he was talking about the temple. And then John says, after he rose from the dead, his disciples realized that he was talking about the temple of his body. Elsewhere, he talks about the sign of Jonah. There's numerous occasions in which he predicts his death and his subsequent resurrection. In fact, I have an article coming out this month in the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus, giving 6 historical arguments on why we can be confident that Jesus predicted his death and resurrection. So, Jesus predicted this. Now, if he didn't rise from the dead, that makes him a false prophet. If he did rise from the dead, then that means that he was who he claimed to be. And that gives us something to think about in terms of our worldview, doesn't it? So that's why the resurrection is important. Everything stands and falls on whether Christianity is true. And biblical scholars know this. In fact, Dale Allison, not at all a conservative Christian, and he refers to the resurrection of Jesus, the study of it, the question we're examining this week, as the prize puzzle of New Testament research. As I mentioned a few moments ago, Gary Habermas, a specialist in the subject, a Christian philosopher, my best friend. He says that there's about 3,400 academic journals and books that have been written on the subject since 1975. Continues to be the hottest topic on historical Jesus out there. Now, most biblical scholars don't have any training when it comes to the philosophy of history and historical method. In fact, what's interesting, a few years ago, I did a study and I looked at the course offerings at all of the 8 Ivy League schools and looked at their undergraduate, graduate level, and doctoral level courses in the departments of religion and philosophy. And looked for all the courses that they offered related to the philosophy of history and historical method. And then I wrote all of those down and added them all up. And you know what the grand total was for undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral level courses in all 8 Ivy League schools in the departments of religion and philosophy. 1. Pretty close. 1. A doctoral level seminar offered at Princeton. And yet, most of these students who will graduate with their PhDs from these Ivy League schools in religion or philosophy, many of them will go out right on the historical Jesus and claim to be historians, and yet they've never had a course on how to do history. My friend Craig Evans, in his book, Fabricating Jesus, said that biblical scholars aren't historians. They've never had any training in this. So, there's a lot that's going out there in the name of people claiming to be historians, and they really just don't know what they're doing. They're just repeating the methods that their professors taught them, but those professors didn't have any training in it either. Now, it's interesting, in his book called The History Primer, J.H. Hexter wrote a pretty neat quote here. Okay, it says, really bad mathematics, therefore, is the consequence of an utter failure of comprehension and results in answers that are simply and wholly false. This sort of total disaster is far less likely in a history examination. When writing about the past, he says, even an ill-informed, stupid student is not likely to get everything all wrong. A slightly informed, intelligent student will do better. While nobody bluffs his way through a written mathematics examination, The same cannot be said of students of history, partly because writing bad history is pretty easy, writing very good history is rare. So according to even this professional philosopher of history, writing very good history is rare.
Luke Timothy Johnson, who's a prominent biblical scholar at Emory University, writes of the bewildering variety of conflicting portraits of Jesus and a distressing carelessness in the manner of arriving at those portraits. So there's a lot of ignorance that's going around in looking for the historical Jesus. People really don't know what they're doing. Now, what we're going to do today, we're going to cover the philosophy of history. We're going to cover a number of things related to the philosophy of history. The first thing that we can talk about is, what is history? How would we define history? Now, those of you who are students have your course notes, right? The fill in the blank stuff? Okay. I found 13 different definitions of the word history by historians. Let me just give you a few of them. Stephen Davis writes that history is understood as the events that occurred in the real past and that historians attempt to discover. John Dominic Carlson defines it as history is the past reconstructed interactively by the present through argued evidence in public discourse. Samuel Gerskog writes that history is an account of what people have done and said in the past, which means that various kinds of biased, pragmatic, and didactic features can be part of the writing of history. Michael Oakeshott writes, history is what really happened. What really happened is what the evidence obliges us to believe. The historical past itself, a construction based on reasoning from evidence, is ultimately a construction within the historian's world of ideas. Luke Timothy Johnson says history is rather a product of human intelligence and imagination. It is one of the ways in which human beings negotiate their present experience and understanding with reference to group and individual memory. So, again, I'm not going to give you all 13 of them, but there are different views and definitions of history. Historians can't even agree amongst themselves on what they're doing. So, for the purposes of our course this week, history is past events that are the object of study. History is past events that are the object of study. Now that leads us to another word, and that is historiography. What is historiography? This is another one of those terms for which there is no agreement. Hayden White, a philosopher of history, defines historiography as quests about history and questions of history. In other words, it's philosophy and method pertaining to history. Actually, I like that definition. Mark Gilderhus says it's the history of historical writing. Abiezer Tucker, another philosopher of history, says historiography is representations of past events, usually texts, but other media such as movies or sound recordings. So, for example, Schindler's List would have been historiography. It's a movie that talks about a historical occurrence in the past. The History Channel, when we watch documentaries, that would be historiography. A biography of someone of the past would be historiography. So there's different and very, very differing definitions of what historiography is. Now we'll come back to that. Now, there are various challenges to knowing the past. Unlike chemistry, history does not involve controlled and repeatable experiments. You can't take an event and put it in the lab and test it. An event that occurred in the past is forever gone. It cannot be reproduced. I mean, we can reenact it, but we can't actually reproduce it to ensure that what we saw in the past, or what we think or about this report in the past, was actually true. Historians can't get into a time machine and go back to verify things. So, like astronomy and geology, in those disciplines, again, you can't reproduce things. All you can do is look at the effects, and you try to take those effects and infer what was it that produced those effects. And the problem, of course, is in many cases you can get a number of different explanations of how these things came to be. And then you have to come up with criteria for how you choose the best of those explanations. And we'll get into those later. By the way, this first day of class today, this is going to be the toughest. Because we are talking about theory, we're going to be talking about method. So if you're not used to this kind of stuff, it can be kind of foreign. I can understand. Try not to get too glassy-eyed. Hang with me a little bit. Just write down your questions. We'll get to them. We're going to take a break at 10. So maybe about 9:45 or 10 of 10, we'll open up for questions. So just hang with me a little bit. This is the toughest part, what we're going through today. So we're just looking at the effects of the past, what we have here today. Like the United States today, what we have, this is the effect of the Revolutionary War. This is one of the effects. When we see archaeological remains, that's the effects we have of specific events in the past. If we see something like dig down in certain places in old or ancient Rome, we can find ashes, which means that there was a fire there in the past, and that would corroborate reports that Rome burned starting on July 18th in the year 64. So we look at these things. We try to figure out what happened in the past by what remains. One of the challenges of history is that historians are select in what they report. So, for example, my wife, Debbie, her grandfather was from he was of German descent, but he took a very meticulous diary starting in his teens, and he wrote down on many days what happened on that day. Well, it's really interesting that when we come to World War I, what was happening, what he was recording, because we know that since they were German, living here in the United States, out in Nebraska, they had to pay some money, war bonds or something. They had to actually pay money to the country. And they have some of these certificates still. So when we look at his diary as a teenager, what's going on during World War I? And when it was announced, you look in his diary and there's nothing about it. He goes, well, I went out and I milked the cows today and fed the horses. That kind of stuff. And then you look every single day that passed. Nothing mentioned about the war. The day, or the Sunday after the war started, I think it was Palm Sunday or Easter, and he records how he fed the horse. He rode at the church in the morning. It was muddy, and he got there, and there were a lot of people at church that morning, probably because not only Easter, but the war, and people, he said, were concerned, but he didn't say what they were concerned about. He doesn't even report about the war. Never even mentions World War I. Why? Well, because it wasn't important to him. Around the year 49, the Roman Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. We wouldn't even know about this except for two sources. In Acts chapter 18, I believe it is, in the first couple of verses, Luke reports that Aquila and Priscilla had come to Corinth because Claudius had recently expelled the Jews from Rome. Well, this was corroborated by a Roman historian about 60 years later named, or 50 or 60 years later, 50 years later named Suetonius, who mentions in his biography of Claudius, section 26, he says, at the instigation of Prestus, Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. Each of them had one sentence about this. Now you would think the Roman emperor expelling all the Jews out of the capital, Rome, that would be recorded somewhere. We only have one sentence in two different sources that report this. And guess what? Josephus, the most prominent Jewish historian who's writing the history of the Jews, never even mentions it. Now, why is that? Because historians were select in the things about which they wrote. They wrote about the things in which they were interested, that were important to them at the time. They weren't thinking about what's going to be important to someone in the 21st century. They're writing for their own folks and what they think is going to be important. And so we have this problem. We're not going to know everything about the past because historians are select in what they write. Therefore, the more sources we have that report about an event, the better, because we're hoping that what one person writes, something that may not be important to the first person, may be important to the second, and we can get a fuller picture. But this is certainly a challenge that is, about which historians are faced. There's also the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. For example, there's exaggeration. Lucian, who was a historian writing in the middle of the 2nd century, talks about a story about Alexander the Great and how he was on a ship out at sea sailing, and there was a biographer on board who wrote a biography of Alexander and came up and gave it to Alexander, and he read it and he said, "This is crazy. You're making me do things that I've never done, and this goes beyond trying to honor me. No one's going to believe this stuff. It's just it's too fantastic." And he took it and threw it overboard, and he said, "I ought to throw you overboard with your book." So historians had a tendency to exaggerate. And when we read ancient biographies, the authors of ancient biographies did not have the same writing conventions that we have today as biographers in the 20th and 21st century. 20th and 21st century biographers try to get things right and reproduce things as they actually occurred as much as possible. In antiquity, a biographer wanted to report things accurately, but they wanted to give you the sense. They wanted to give you more of the sense of, they wanted to paint a portrait. And when we look at old portraits that go back hundreds and hundreds of years, we see the figure in a scenario in which maybe they never were in, but it was painted that way in order to communicate the character of that person. It's a portrait. Different than a photograph, it's a portrait to give you an idea about what that person's like. That's what ancient biographies did as well. Sometimes they weren't so much concerned about pinpoint accuracy as they were communicating about the moral teachings, the ethical teachings, the philosophical and religious teachings of that person, and what they did in their adulthood. True? Yes. But true literally in some cases? No. And biographers took various liberties on how accurate they would write things. Or I should say this, they differed in the amount of liberties that they took. Some, like Appian, took a lot of liberties, while others, like Suetonius, didn't take much liberties. So when we come to the Gospels, which were ancient biographies, we've got to ask ourselves, how much liberties did they take? And that becomes a difficult question, but we'll look at that a little bit later on. I believe that's day 3. Might be latter part of tomorrow, though. So you've got exaggeration, there's deceit. Like, for example, back in, when was it, the 80s with Tiananmen Square, and over in China, in Beijing, and the Chinese have rewritten history to say that that didn't happen. Although we've got video footage of showing this happens. You just rewrite history. So there's deceit involved. We have faulty perceptions. Did you know that when the Titanic sank, the survivors had contradictory accounts of what happened? Some said the ship broke in two prior to sinking, and others said, no, she went down intact. Now, how do you get that wrong? But some of them did, didn't they? So there's all sorts of faulty perceptions. Then there's also faulty memory. Now, I had a humbling experience a few years ago. Like I said, I'm 48, and I grew up in Baltimore during the time when the Baltimore Orioles were really good. They were a team to talk about. I mean, you had Jim Palmer and Brooks Robinson and Frank Robinson and Paul Blair and all these great players on the team. They were winning the World Series. They were in the postseason every year. It was just great. It's a fun time to be an Orioles fan. Many of you would relate that with the Braves of the 90s now, wouldn't you? But during that time, my favorite pitcher was Jim Palmer. In fact, he pitched the first game I went to in 1971. And I remember as a teenager watching the Orioles on TV, and I remember one Sunday afternoon watching the game and seeing Palmer hit a home run, an inside the park home run. And so years later, I'm talking probably, I don't know, within the last 10 years, I got to meet Jim Palmer. And I was talking to him, first time I'd ever met him, and I said, Jim, tell me, I was watching you on TV, it was Sunday afternoon back in the 70s, and you hit an inside the park home run. What did that feel like? And he said, well, I never hit an inside the park home run. I could have never done that. I was always so slow. Now, I hit several home runs during my career, but never an inside the park home run. I thought, oh, okay. So what probably happened, back then, and it was American League, and designated hitter rule wasn't in effect at that point, so pitchers had to hit, and they always struck out or got out anyway. So he must have just hit a home run, and it was just such a big thing in my mind that over the years I embellished it in my head to think that it was an inside the park home run. Now, it doesn't nullify the fact that he hit a home run now, does it? But it got embellished over the years. And I didn't even realize this was happening in my head. So, of course, the earlier a historian is reporting an event, the better now, isn't it? So these are just some of the challenges you have. Exaggeration, deceit, faulty perceptions, and faulty memory. Another challenge is that much of the reports of the past have been lost. We don't have everything that has been written about the past. Of Tacitus, the greatest ancient Roman historian, he wrote 16 books, but 4 of those are missing, and parts of another 4 are missing. So we only have 8. We only have half of his work and portions of another 25% of it. There were 12 biographies written by Plutarch in the early part of the 2nd century that are lost. So he wrote about 50. We've got about 38 of those biographies that are left. And the ones that are lost, Caesar Augustus, Claudius, and Nero, 3 big figures of the 1st century, they're lost. They're gone. We don't have those anymore. Scipio Africanus, the general who beat Hannibal in the wars before Jesus was born. We don't have his biography any longer, the one that was written by Plutarch. That's been lost. There was an early Christian author who may have had ties. He was probably twice removed from the Apostle John. His name was Papias. He wrote in the early part of the 2nd century. And Papias wrote 5 volumes that were commentaries on the discourses or sayings of Jesus. They've all been lost. Wouldn't that be nice to have? All we have are a few fragments preserved in the writings of ancient authors who had them at the time. That's all, who quote them. So a lot of what we have been lost. When we read 1 Corinthians, we're actually reading 2 Corinthians, because the very first letter that Paul wrote to the church of Corinth has been lost. There may have been a second letter that he wrote to the church of Corinth that was also lost. We're probably missing 1 or more letters that Paul wrote to the Philippian church. Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, he writes about the letters. He was writing, we still have one of his letters to the church of Philippi, and he writes about Paul's letters to them at Philippi. Well, we only have 1. What happened to at least 1 other? So we're missing that. Wouldn't that be cool to find something like that? I mean, can you imagine it? What if it had said something in it like, now, I'd like to address an issue that some of you are raising. Obviously, some of you have read my letter to the church at Rome, where I talk about the elect and being predestined, and you've had some questions about that. Let me clarify that for you now. Wouldn't that be nice? So we are missing some things. Now, perhaps the biggest challenge to the historian is what is called horizon. And a horizon involves our biases. It involves our worldview. It involves all of our knowledge, our experiences. It's the way we look at things. It's the way we were raised. It's based on our race, gender, ethics, nationality, our theological, philosophical, and religious convictions, the theological or any kind of academic institutions that we may attend, the people we hang around, our peers, the very group of people whose acceptance and respect we desire. We're all impacted by these things. And this is called our horizon. And our horizon forms how we look at our external world. They're like a pair of sunglasses that have a particular shape to them. It's how we view everything. Just for example, remember the Super Bowl last year? Last play? Who was watching the Super Bowl last year? Any of you?
Yeah.
Just a few of you? Last play of the Super Bowl. Kurt Warner goes back to pass, right? I mean, it's just so intense because the game is just going back and forth. Anyone could win this. The teams were so evenly matched. He goes back to pass, and the Steeler comes in, and as Warner goes to pass, the Steeler hits him. The ball comes loose. Pittsburgh falls on it. Now, if there's a penalty involved, and there may very well have been downfield, if there was a penalty involved, not St. Louis, but Phoenix gets the ball a little closer, and they got the best receiver in the NFL at this point. It can be a different result. And you say, well, what is it? Well, they said, well, it's a fumble. And you think, whoa, what is it? And you watch the replay, and it's so hard to determine because it was so close. So was it a fumble, or was it an incomplete pass? Chances are how you ruled on the matter was largely dependent on whether you were pulling for Phoenix or Pittsburgh. I mean, I love the Braves. I go to Braves games. You know, was the runner safe or out? Trying to steal second base, is he safe or out? Well, it depends. Is the guy trying to steal on the Atlanta Braves or the other team? You know, if he's out and it's a Brave, you know, the umpire, what do you mean? You can't see. You must be biased toward the other team, you know? So that's just the way we are. And when it comes to something like historical studies, historical research, historians are going to be biased, even in non-religious matters. In fact, there was a study done several years ago on historians. They interviewed several thousand historians to see what is your primary motivation for being a historian. And they were talking about because they want to be able to defend their ideology. Could be their political ideology, or religion came seventh on the list. Do you think historians aren't biased? Of course they are. And if historians are biased when it comes to something like Jesus, studying Jesus, they're going to be all the more biased now, aren't they? And it's not just Christians. I used to be so afraid that when I'd get up in a debate, I'd be accused of being biased because I'm a Christian. That doesn't bother me at all right now. Of course I'm biased. Everyone's biased. The question isn't whether we're biased. Listen, I'm going to show you some things that I did and what we can do in order to help manage or minimize our bias or the impacts of it during our investigations. But everybody's biased. And so the question isn't what's our bias. The question is what are our arguments for supporting our position. You can be biased and you can be true and you can be right in what you're saying. It was Jewish historians who brought out most of the truth about the Holocaust. Why? Because Gentile historians didn't care too much, didn't impact them. But the Jewish historians wanted to bring this out more on what happened to their people to make sure this never happened again. Their bias drove them to find more facts and to present them with better and greater accuracy. So bias doesn't necessarily mean that you're wrong. We're all biased. Now, the question is, how do we transcend our horizon? What things can we do in order to help minimize the negative impacts of our bias? So let me show you a couple of things I'd like to suggest. As we go down History Highway this week, so we can see how history is done and take this journey to talk about the resurrection of Jesus. There are 4 speed bumps that I think we can lay down on the road along the way. Speed bumps because they slow us down and cause us to proceed cautiously. And just like on a road outside, if we ignore speed bumps and just go flying over them like new drivers like to do, we can ruin... My daughter has just started driving. Unbelievable. I guess a lot of us are like that when we start driving, and we just don't remember it. Selective memory again, right? Woo, it is scary, though. I was talking to my wife. She did the same thing when she was driving. She said, I remember when I started driving, I started backing out of the driveway, and you know, I didn't bother cleaning off my windows. She grew up in Nebraska, and icy and stuff out there, and you get ice and stuff. She almost hit a trash truck passing by, and her sister said, "You got to stop!" So she slammed on the brakes and said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Well, I think he just stopped for me." And backing out, you know. Oh, the dumb things we do as kids. But so we don't want to go over speed bumps as though they don't exist because we can hurt our car. And likewise, we want to lay down these speed bumps because they cause us to proceed cautiously in our historical investigation. If we're not aware of our bias, if we don't take measures in order to minimize our bias in historical investigation, then it can wreck and damage our historical investigation. One of those speed bumps would be detachment from bias. Detachment from bias. This is hard to do, but we want to recognize our bias. If you have a bad habit, like alcoholism or something, the number one thing to do is to recognize you've got the problem. To recognize you've got the problem. Same thing with bias. You've got to recognize you've got a bias, you've got your horizons, and you want to do your best to detach yourself from the desired outcome while your investigation proceeds. You can't get outside of your horizon, but you can make a deliberate effort to detach yourself from your desired outcome. So for me, it's like, okay, I know I want Jesus to be raised from the dead, but I've got to keep that in mind that is what I want and do my best not to allow that to influence my investigation. A second thing is we call bedrock or historical bedrock. We'll talk more about that on probably day 3 on Wednesday. These are facts. Historical bedrock are facts that are so strongly evidenced that virtually all scholars who study the subject have come to agree that these are facts, including skeptical ones. In other words, all of your hypothesis has to be built upon a strong foundation, and we want to start that and lay that foundation with virtually indisputable facts. If a hypothesis, which is a fancy term for theory, but hypothesis is what historians talk about, so that's what I'm going to talk about instead of theory. They don't use theory, that term. If a hypothesis cannot account for the historical bedrock, then that means it's a faulty hypothesis. You either drag it back to the drawing board and rework it, or you discard it. It has to account for the historical bedrock. Third, you want to submit your findings to critics, unsympathetic critics. That's what I like to do when it came to debating, because I could submit my argument to critics who had an axe to grind. They had reason to find holes in my arguments, and so I could get some criticism from them. I'm looking forward to publishing my dissertation and get some critical review on it. It's probably true that not everything in there is going to be accurate. So there will be some things that critics, some of them will be nice about it, some won't be nice about it, and they'll criticize, and I'll just have to try to look through the unnice things that they say, and then try to say, okay, well, where is it that I'm wrong on this? And there will be some things I agree with them, and some things I won't agree, because they've got their own biases, and so they're going to be wrong on some of the things that they say, just like people I debate are going to be wrong on a lot of the things that they say. And the fourth thing would be specific method. Most historians don't use a specific method. Certainly, biblical scholars don't. Now, they'll have specific criteria, like the criteria of early reports, multiple independent reports, eyewitness reports, embarrassing reports, things like that. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to specific historical method for comparing hypotheses to see which one is to be preferred. Biblical scholars don't typically do that, and unfortunately what I discovered is professional historians, for the most part, don't do it either. And so you have C.B. McCullough, a very prominent philosopher of history, says that this leads to a haphazard practice of history. But these are things that you do, because see, if I'm presenting a method, and I'm going to give you a specific method to use today, when I say this is the method that I'm using in investigating the resurrection of Jesus and comparing hypotheses, then that method is open now to public scrutiny. And so someone could say, okay, well, I don't like your method. I think your method is skewed in such a way so as to make your conclusion much easier to arrive at. They could accuse me of that. So, I had to look at that when I was putting this together, but this isn't my own method I'm giving you. This is a method by very careful professional historians who use method along these ways. Okay, now what about a consensus? Do we need a consensus? Bart Ehrman, I've debated him twice, and he says you can't say that something has been proven unless you have a consensus on the matter. Well, I disagree with that. There have been consensuses in the past, like I see a lot of African Americans here. 150 years ago or so, there was a consensus that blacks weren't persons. Did that mean that blacks weren't persons? No. There was a consensus in Nazi Germany against the Jews and their view about the Jews. Did that mean that they were correct on that? No. Consensuses are often wrong. Consensus are useful at times, in academic circles when we talk about things. But it doesn't take a consensus to say that you've proven something. It might mean that you haven't been able to convince people that you're correct, but it doesn't mean you haven't proven something yet.
Now, when we look at a consensus, we want it to be what we would term heterogeneous. And what that means, heterogeneous, means that it's formed of all different perspectives and groups. So, for example, in biblical studies today, there's a group called the Jesus Seminar. And these are a group of scholars, almost all of whom, not all, but almost all of whom are on the radical theological left. And what they did back in the 90s was they took all these votes about the sayings and acts of Jesus to see, well, which ones do we really believe as scholars that he actually did? Did Jesus actually walk on water? Did Jesus actually say this parable? Things like this. And so they would vote on these things. And the Jesus Seminar said about only 16% of what Jesus said and reported that what Jesus said in the New Testament that he actually said. And only about 14% of what he actually was reported to have done in the New Testament that he actually did these things. And they said this is the consensus of scholars. Well, no, it isn't. It's the consensus of your radical subculture called the Jesus Seminar that's comprised almost entirely of radical leftist theologians. So that really tells us nothing about what a really honest consensus would say. It'd be no different than the Evangelical Theological Society getting together every year, voting on the sayings of Jesus. And since they already believe in biblical inerrancy, that Jesus said everything as it's reported in the New Testament, well, what other kind of conclusion would you expect them to come to? So I'm not saying biblical inerrancy is wrong. I'm a biblical inerrantist. I'm saying, but that would not be a heterogeneous group either, would it? So a heterogeneous group, when we're talking about consensus, it's got to be people from all different backgrounds. That's the only way a consensus really matters. Okay? You also want those who have researched the topic. A guy I'm going to be debating next month at Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas, has made a big deal out of the surveys of Gary Habermas, who talks about consensus in various areas, like the empty tomb. He says 2/3 to 3/4. Habermas says 2/3 to 3/4 of scholars today believe in the empty tomb. And the guy I'm going to be debating, Richard Carrier, says, well, no, I know a lot of scholars who don't believe in the empty tomb. They just haven't written on it. Well, it's irrelevant what they think. If they're not a specialist in the subject, it doesn't matter what they think. Who cares what I think about an archaeological find if I've never really studied it? Those who are experts on a subject are writing on that subject. If they're not published, their opinions aren't very valuable in this area. So we want a heterogeneous group, and we want experts on the area. That's all that really matters. Now, even at this, the problem you have is that even most experts are unable to transcend their horizon. Most of them never even try to put it in check. It's something, you know how when you're thinking about getting a new car, let's say you're looking at Hondas or something. Do you notice how many Hondas you now see on the road? You know what I'm talking about? That specific car. If you're looking for an Accord, it's amazing how many Accords people are driving Accords then. If you're looking at a Camry, it's amazing now how many people are driving Camrys that you never noticed before, isn't it? Well, now, when I became aware of my own biases, it's amazing that as I started reading all the literature out there written on the subject of the resurrection of Jesus, how you just see the biases of other scholars just coming through their work. They're clueless that they're even being guided by it. They don't even try to shelve it. It's amazing. A consensus is rare in non-religious matters. And so when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus or something about the historical of Jesus, a consensus is almost always never going to be available. It will be on some minor issues, but there are very few things in which we're going to find a consensus. And so consensuses are going to be interesting. We're going to look at it when we come to facts that we can know that upon which we're going to build our case for the resurrection of Jesus, but we're not going to rely on a consensus in order to get at our conclusions. There just simply are none in this area.